Hi, I'm Mr. Wallace, and today we're going to be talking about populations. A population is a group of organisms of the same species living in the same area. So these buffalo here would represent a population. Now when we discuss populations or study populations, there are a couple of things that we need to know about. The first is going to be the distribution. So where is the population found? How do they use their environment? The second thing would be abundance. This would be the population size, but also things like growth rate and age structure of the population. The third thing would be interactions between the organisms that are in that population. How do organisms in the population interact with each other? So for distribution, the major concept that you need to understand is the habitat. Organisms within a population live in a habitat. Now the habitat is composed of biotic factors, which are all the living things that impact that population in that area. So those things would be plants, fungus, bacteria, the other animals in the population, that sort of thing. Abiotic factors in the environment would also affect an organism in its habitat. So abiotic factors would be things that are non-living. So sunlight, temperature, weather, amount of water, acidity of soil, that sort of thing. So organisms are tolerant of abiotic conditions within a certain range, and that's going to help determine which organisms are found where. So down on the graph here we see the range of tolerance graph. If on the x-axis here you have some sort of an environmental condition or an abiotic factor, let's say for example temperature, then every organism is going to have some temperature that they do best at, and so that would be considered the optimal temperature. And so right here in the green we have the optimal range, and you can see when the temperature is in that optimal range, we've got lots and lots of butterflies here. So the organism does really, really well within that range. As you move farther away, either above or below the optimal range, the success of that organism goes down. Organisms have a harder time succeeding, a harder time reproducing, and so they eventually, as you get far enough away from that optimal range, eventually the organism can no longer survive in that environment because the environment is that abiotic factor is outside that organism's range of tolerance. Also, part of the distribution would be the dispersion, and what dispersion is the arrangement of the organisms within a population's habitat. So how are they using the habitat that they have? So for example here we have a random dispersion. This is the first type, and actually with the least common type. Typically plants and that sort of thing shows a random dispersion, but most animals don't. Random dispersion, basically these plants just put their seeds out into the wind and they just end up wherever they end up. And so you end up with organisms just kind of scattered throughout their habitat, represented by the square here. A much more common type of arrangement would be the clumped arrangement down here. You see wolves, you see pretty much all animals have a clumped arrangement, and generally within the habitat, if the habitat is represented by the square, the animals are grouped within that habitat. And this could be because the animals are in some sort of a social structure like a pack. It could also be that these locations where the animals are is the location of the resources within the habitat. So maybe there's a pond or water of some sort, or bunch of trees, or some sort of resource is found in these locations, and so that's by nature that's where the animals gather. And most animals follow this sort of a dispersion. Regular or uniform dispersion would be the third type, and that would be where each animal kind of has its own little territory. It's equidistant from all of its partners in the population, and so these penguins here exhibit a regular dispersion. Some plants do this as well. They try and keep other plants away so that they don't have to compete for the resources. And so, like, for example, in a desert, you'll find creosote bushes that are all evenly spaced. Each one keeps all the other plants away. Abundance refers to the amount of organisms, or the number of organisms in the population, and so there we're looking at population growth. We see here exponential growth, and it should make sense that most organisms would undergo exponential growth in perfect conditions. So in exponential growth, the population starts out small, but as the population grows, you have more and more babies, and so the population is going to grow faster and faster. And so that's exponential growth. Typically, it shows up in organisms that have very, very short lifespans and reproduce very, very quickly. Weeds, plants, maybe fish, that sort of thing, that can put out millions of eggs or seeds at a time, and so reproduce very, very quickly. Most organisms, however, would be limited by the resources in an area, and so they would show something called logistic growth. which starts out very similar to exponential growth, slowly at first, and then it gets faster and faster as the population rises. More and more babies come into the population, and therefore they can have more and more babies of their own. But at some point, resources become stressed. You start to run out of food, start to run out of space, that sort of thing. And so the population growth is going to slow down. As food begins to become scarce, organisms have fewer and fewer babies. And so the population is going to steady out here, and you reach this flat point, this steady point. And this then, on a logistic growth graph, this would represent what's called the carrying capacity. Logistic growth is going to settle out at the carrying capacity, which is the number of organisms that a certain area can hold. So once the population reaches that number, then it's going to steady out and remain stable. Now, limiting factors are the things that are actually causing this logistic growth. These are things that are going to limit population growth and cause populations to stop increasing and sometimes even to decrease. So we've got two kinds of limiting factors. There's density-dependent and density-independent. Density-dependent limiting factors are the ones that they depend upon the density. If the population is small, disease or resources don't limit the population. There's plenty of resources to go around. A small population isn't going to attract much attention from predators. Disease doesn't play much of a role because the organisms are so far apart. But as the density increases, as the population goes up, then disease spreads much more easily through the population. Resources begin to become limited, and predators begin to key in on this population as a source of food. And so all these things are going to become more and more, they're going to have a greater impact as the population density increases. Density-independent limiting factors are just basically chance events. Here, the density or the size of the population doesn't even matter. A fire wipes through a forest, it's going to limit the population no matter how dense or how large that population is. Very often natural disasters, that sort of thing, would be density-independent limiting factors. Looking at the abundance of organisms in a population, another key thing that you would need to address is the age structure. So looking at the age structure and at the survivorship curves of a population gives us a good way to predict what's going to happen to a population in the future. So if you look at what's going on over here, we see that the yellow bars represent males and the blue bars represent females, and you get percentages of population across the x-axis. And so what we see is that in these age ranges, most of the organisms in this particular population would be young, which means that at some point they're going to enter sexual maturity and start having babies of their own. Very, very few of the individuals in this population are very old. So this population is going to end up showing a very rapid growth pattern. This one is going to increase rapidly. This population right here, you see that there's a pretty even distribution of ages across the population. And so as this population goes through time, it's going to remain stable. It's not going to grow very rapidly. And right here we see a population where there's very few that are in the young range. Most of the organisms in the population are middle-aged, and so they're either in or just past reproductive age. And so this population is going to show very slow growth or no growth at all, in fact. In fact, it might even shrink a little bit. And so this type of a graph that shows age structure is a good way of predicting what's going to happen to the future of the population. Looking at survivorship curves, what we see is that there are several different kinds of survivorship curves for different organisms. And so what we have is the age of the organism across the x-axis, and we have the number of survivors on the y-axis here. And so a type 1 survivorship curve, these types of organisms, almost all of the organisms in the population are going to survive childhood. And so we see as the age increases, very few die, very few die, very few die. And then when you get out here to where the organisms are very old, then we see a rapid drop-off in the population. And so most organisms are dying at old age and not at childhood. Type 2 survivorship curve would be organisms that basically die at the same rate throughout their lifespan. So birds are a good example of this. A lot of birds die when they're either before they hatch or just after they hatch, and that death sort of carries on at a relatively stable pace throughout the lifespan. So birds are just as likely to die at middle age, teenage, childhood as they are at adulthood. And so you see a nice steady drop in the population. Type 3 survivorship curves would be where most of the organisms die before they get very old at all. They die in childhood. So these would be things that put thousands and thousands or millions of seeds or pollen or eggs out there, and most of them die very, very early. Very few of them survive past the first few months or first year, but those that do then go on and live a long time. And so that would be a type 3. So trees or insects, that sort of thing, would be this type 3 survivorship curve. The last thing that we're looking at within a population would be the interactions that an organism has with the other organisms in that population. And so you can think of things like competition. The wolves in this particular picture are competing with each other to get enough food. Competition is a real common interaction, both between organisms in a population and also between populations of different organisms. Cooperation is another way that organisms in a population interact. The muskox is famous for protecting its babies when there's a wolf nearby. The adults will surround the babies and put out this defensive front so the wolf sees nothing but horns. Ground squirrels and prairie dogs will stand up. They'll have sentinels that will stand up and watch for predators to keep the other organisms in the population alert to whether there's predators that are coming. Mating behaviors, there's both the reproductive behavior itself, which is one way that organisms interact in a population, but there's also the competition for mates that males often do. These bighorn sheep do it, the elk and various different organisms will bat heads to establish dominance and the right to mate. And there's a social structure and rank interaction that many organisms go through. Wolves, survive in a pack, and chimpanzees in a troop, and a lot of different organisms, especially animals, exhibit some sort of social structure or rank. And then there's things like insects where you have bees, the colony of bees with the queen bee and the worker bees and that sort of thing. So ants is a similar thing there. So a variety of interactions within populations that will be important to study. That's it. I hope that was helpful.